In July 1944, while armies were still fighting across Europe and the Pacific, 730 delegates from 44 countries checked into a resort hotel in the New Hampshire mountains. They weren't there for the fighting. They were there to decide something just as consequential, whose currency would run the world once the fighting stopped. For 3 weeks, in overcrowded rooms with broken plumbing and not nearly enough beds, these men quietly redrew the entire architecture of global finance, and at the center of it sat two brilliant, exhausted men who fundamentally disagreed about how the new system should work, one representing an empire already too broke to argue, the other representing the only country that had gotten richer. From the war, this is the story of how that argument was settled, and how it made the American dollar the most powerful currency the world had ever seen. To understand why this conference mattered so much, you have to go back to what had happened to the global economy in the 2 decades before it. A collapse so severe had helped drag the entire world into war in the first place. That collapse is where this story actually begins. Before the First World War, most of the world operated on the gold standard currencies directly convertible to a fixed weight of gold, a system that had kept exchange rates stable for decades. That war shattered it. Nations suspended convertibility to print money for the fighting, and when they tried to return to gold afterward, they did it at exchange rates that no longer matched economic reality. Britain's return to the gold standard in 1925 at its old pre-war rate made its exports catastrophically overpriced, a decision Keynes himself had publicly warned against at the time. Then in 1929, the American stock market collapsed, and the fragile, patched-together international monetary system collapsed along with it. Banks failed by the thousands. International lending froze completely, and one by one, nations abandoned the gold standard entirely, letting their currencies float free, or more accurately, sink. What followed was a decade of what economists still call beggar thy neighbor policy. Every major economy deliberately devaluing its own currency to make its exports cheaper, hoping to steal a competitive edge from everyone else. Britain devalued. The United States devalued. France devalued. Each move designed to help one economy at the direct expense of its trading partners. The predictable result was a race to the bottom. Global trade collapsed by more than half between 1929 and 1934, as nations threw up tariffs and currency controls to protect what little economic activity remained. Unemployment soared past 20% in country after country, and the economic desperation this created didn't stay contained to finance ministries and trading floors. It fed directly into the political extremism that would define the following decade, a connection the men planning Bretton Woods understood with total clarity, because most of them had lived through both halves of it by the time the Second World War broke out in 1939. There was already a quiet consensus forming among allied economists that whatever came after this war, the international monetary system that had helped, because it could never be allowed to return. Planning for a new system actually began years before the war ended, in the middle of the fighting itself, with the outcome still very much in doubt. In Britain, that planning fell largely to one man, already the most famous economist alive, and now working himself toward physical collapse, trying to design a system that could save his country's position in the post-war world. John Maynard Keynes wasn't just an economist by 1940. He was effectively acting as an unofficial ambassador for a British economy that was running out of money faster than almost anyone in London wanted to admit publicly. Britain had spent itself into extraordinary debt fighting the war, much of it owed directly to the United States through a wartime lending arrangement called Lend-Lease. That debt gave Washington enormous leverage over any post-war negotiation, leverage that would shape absolutely everything that happened at Bretton Woods 4 years later. On the American side, the man doing the equivalent planning worked inside the U.S. Treasury Department, far less famous than Keynes, but arguably about to win the far more important argument. His name was Harry Dexter White, a Treasury economist who had the ear of Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau and a clear, unapologetic vision. The post-war financial system should be built around American economic power, not shared equally with an exhausted British Empire. Both men began drafting formal proposals in 1941 and 1942, competing blueprints for the entire post-war monetary order, developed independently, an ocean apart, by two governments that were supposedly fighting on the same side. Keynes proposed something genuinely radical, a new international currency that no single nation would control, designed specifically to prevent any one economy from dominating the others, the way this new system was about to let America dominate everyone. White's plan was far simpler and far more favorable to the country he represented. The U.S. dollar, backed by American gold reserves, would become the anchor every other currency was measured against. Two visions, two men. And by the summer of 1944, only one of them was going to leave. That New Hampshire hotel as the actual blueprint for how the world's money would work. What happened? Inside those negotiating rooms is where the real story begins. Keynes traveled to Washington multiple times between 1943 and 1944, formally presenting what he called the International Clearing Union, his proposal for a genuinely neutral global monetary system. At the heart of his plan sat a proposed new unit of account he named the Bancor, not a currency any ordinary person would ever hold, but an accounting unit used to settle balances between central banks. Its most radical feature was a built-in penalty, not just for countries that ran up debts, but for countries that ran up too large a surplus too. Keynes wanted to punish hoarding, not just borrowing. That detail wasn't accidental. Keynes had watched America accumulate enormous gold reserves throughout the 1930s, while much of the rest of the world starved for liquidity, and he wanted a system that would never again let one country sit on that much financial power unchecked, which is precisely the feature the American delegation had no intention of accepting, because by 1944, the United States was exactly that country, holding roughly 60% of the entire world's monetary gold reserves. White's counterproposal, formally called the International Stabilization Fund, offered something that sounded similar on paper, a shared pool of resources to help countries manage currency crises, but built on entirely different foundations. Instead of a neutral new currency, White's fund would be denominated in existing national currencies, with voting power assigned based on how much gold and capital each country actually contributed, which meant, unavoidably, that the country contributing the most, the United States, by an enormous margin, would end up holding the most influence over how the entire system operated. Keynes understood exactly what this meant, and he fought hard against it in private correspondence at one point, describing aspects of White's approach as designed to entrench American financial supremacy rather than build genuine international cooperation. But Keynes wasn't negotiating from a position of strength, and both men knew it. Britain needed continued American financial support to survive the war, and increasingly, to survive what came after it. Every argument Keynes made for a more balanced system ran into the same wall. It was asking the country footing most of the bill to voluntarily accept less control over how that money would be governed. There's a particularly telling detail from White's own later record. Declassified intelligence would eventually reveal that White had been passing sensitive economic information to Soviet contacts. Throughout much of this same era. It's a genuinely strange footnote to this story. The American architect of the post-war capitalist financial order was, by multiple later investigations, also secretly cooperating with Soviet intelligence at the same time he was designing it. White would later deny the most serious allegations before Congress, and died of a heart attack days after testifying. Historians still debate exactly how much of what he shared mattered, but it's a reminder that even the most consequential architecture in modern finance was built by deeply human, deeply flawed people. By the spring of 1944, with the war's outcome finally turning decisively in the Allies' favor, both sides knew a formal conference was coming, and both knew, quietly, which plan was really going to win. In May 1944, the formal invitation went out to 44 allied and associated nations, inviting them to send delegates to a resort in the New Hampshire mountains that July to finalize the post-war monetary system before the war itself was even finished. Most of those 44 nations had almost no real influence over what would ultimately be decided. This was never going to be a negotiation among equals. It was going to be a negotiation between one exhausted empire and one rising superpower, conducted in front of an audience. On July 1st, 1944, that audience began arriving at the Mount Washington Hotel, and what happened over the following 3 weeks would determine how the entire world bought, sold, borrowed, and saved money for the next 3 decades. That conference is where we go next. The Mount Washington Hotel had never hosted anything close to this scale of event. 730 delegates and support staff descended on a building designed for a fraction of that number. Rooms meant for 2 held 4. Plumbing failed under the strain within days. Delegates from some of the smaller nations found themselves sleeping in converted storage spaces, while the American and British delegations occupied the hotel's best suites. It was, from the very first day, an accurate physical metaphor for the negotiation itself, a system built to project shared international cooperation, while the real decisions happened in a handful of well-appointed rooms. Keynes arrived already unwell, suffering from a heart condition that his doctors had warned could be fatal under stress. He'd pushed himself through 18-hour days anyway, chairing key commissions and fighting for provisions he increasingly suspected he wasn't going to win. White, by contrast, moved through the conference with the confidence of a man who already knew how the math was going to work out in his country's favor. The formal negotiations split into 3 commissions, one on the proposed international fund, one on a new World Bank for post-war reconstruction, and one on other matters of international cooperation. White chaired the most important one himself. Behind the formal sessions, the real negotiating happened in private meetings, hallway conversations, and late-night drafting sessions between a small handful of senior officials from just a few key delegations. The Soviet delegation, notably, participated actively throughout and would even sign the final agreement, but ultimately never ratified it. A decision that foreshadowed the Cold War division that was already beginning to take shape beneath the surface of this supposedly unified Allied conference. Smaller nations, meanwhile, mostly watched from the margins. Delegates from Latin America and from colonial territories still years from independence had little real ability to shape outcomes that would define their economies for a generation. By the second week, it had become unmistakably clear which plan was winning. White's framework, a dollar-centered system, gold-backed, American-led, was going to form the backbone of the final agreement, with only cosmetic concessions offered to Keynes's competing vision. Keynes's bancor was quietly dropped almost entirely. The idea of penalizing surplus nations, the provision aimed squarely at reigning in American financial dominance, never made it into the final text in any meaningful form. What Keynes did manage to win were smaller, softer concessions, some flexibility in how nations could adjust their exchange rates, and a formal role for Britain in the new institution's governance that acknowledged its history without restoring its former power. In private letters home, Keynes was notably blunt about what had actually happened. He understood he had been present at the creation of a new financial order, just not the one he had spent years designing. On July 22nd, 1944, after 3 exhausting weeks, the delegates formally signed off on what would become known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, establishing 2 entirely new institutions and a completely new framework for global currency. The 2 institutions were the International Monetary Fund, designed to help countries manage short-term currency crises, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, what we now know as the World Bank, designed to fund the physical rebuilding of a war-shattered world. Both institutions would be headquartered in Washington, not London, not Geneva. A small, largely unremarked detail at the time that quietly confirmed exactly where the center of global financial power had actually moved. And at the core of the entire system sat the mechanism that would define global finance for the next 27 years, the arrangement that gave this whole story its name. Every currency in the new system would be pegged to the U.S. dollar at a fixed but adjustable rate, and the dollar itself would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, a rate the United States formally guaranteed to honor for any foreign government that wanted to redeem its dollars for gold. In other words, the world wasn't really on a gold standard anymore. It was on a dollar standard, and the dollar, in turn, rested on America's promise to keep its word about gold. That distinction sounds technical. It would turn out to be the single most important detail in this entire agreement, the exact theme that would eventually tear the whole system apart. 27 years later, but in the summer of 1944, none of that fracture was visible yet. What was visible was an American dollar about to become the undisputed center of the entire global economy. That's where we go next, when the war finally ended in 1945. The practical value of the new system became obvious almost immediately. Europe's economies were shattered, its currencies worthless on international markets, and its need for stable, trusted money desperate. The dollar was the only major currency that had emerged from the war fully intact, fully convertible and backed by the largest gold reserve on the planet. Everyone needed dollars to rebuild factories, to buy American grain, to stabilize their own currencies. In 1948, the United States formalized that dependency through the Marshall Plan. Over $12 billion in aid distributed across Western Europe, almost all of it flowing directly into dollar-denominated reconstruction. The plan rebuilt Europe's shattered industrial base and simultaneously cemented the dollar as the currency every serious economy on Earth needed to hold in reserve. By the early 1950s, the dollar had become something no currency had ever quite been before. Not just a national currency, but the effective operating system of the entire global economy. International trade contracts were priced in dollars. Central banks around the world held dollars as their primary reserve asset. Oil, grain, and industrial commodities were increasingly quoted and settled in dollars. Regardless of which two countries were actually doing the trading. This gave the United States a form of economic power that no earlier empire had ever quite possessed, the ability to run its own domestic policy while every other economy on Earth adjusted around it. A French finance minister would later famously describe this as America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the currency the rest of the world needed and effectively export the costs of its own economic choices to everyone else holding dollars. Through the 1950s, that privilege appeared to be working exactly as designed. Global trade rebounded far beyond pre-war levels. Currency crises, once a near-constant feature of the interwar years, became far rarer under the new fixed but adjustable system. The IMF stepped in repeatedly to help countries manage short-term currency pressure without triggering the kind of competitive devaluation spirals that had helped wreck the 1930s economy. For nearly 2 decades, Bretton Woods appeared to be exactly what its architects had hoped for, a stable, rules-based system that had finally tamed the chaos of unmanaged national currencies. But underneath that stability, a structural problem was quietly building, one that had been built into the system's foundation from its very first day at that hotel in New Hampshire, and that almost nobody outside a small circle of economists was paying close attention to yet. The problem had a name, coined by a Belgian-American economist who saw it coming years before it actually happened. It was called the Triffin Dilemma, and it described a contradiction sitting at the very heart of the entire system Bretton Woods had built. The contradiction Robert Triffin identified was deceptively simple. The rest of the world needed a constant growing supply of dollars to keep trading, growing and holding reserves, but the only way for the United States to supply that many dollars was to run persistent deficits, spending and lending more dollars abroad than it was taking back in, and every one of those dollars circulating abroad was still, technically, backed by America's promise to redeem it for gold at $35 an ounce, on demand, from any foreign central bank that asked, which meant that the more successful Bretton Woods became, the more the world grew, traded, and needed dollars. The more dollars existed outside America's own gold vaults, claiming a share of a gold supply that wasn't growing anywhere near as fast. Eventually, the math simply couldn't hold. If every foreign holder of dollars had ever tried to redeem them for gold at once, the United States physically would not have had enough gold in Fort Knox to honor its own promise. For years, that was a theoretical problem, not a practical one, because most nations, for political and strategic reasons, simply chose not to test America's promise by demanding gold en masse. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, though America's own spending only accelerated the strain, the Vietnam War and an ambitious set of domestic social programs both required enormous government spending increasingly financed by printing more dollars rather than raising taxes. Foreign governments watched America's gold-to-dollar ratio deteriorate year after year, and a small number of them started doing exactly what the system had always technically allowed, but never really expected at scale. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, became the most aggressive and public example, openly criticizing America's exorbitant privilege and sending French naval vessels to physically retrieve gold from American reserves in exchange for French-held dollars. Other nations followed with quieter versions of the same move. America's gold reserves, once so dominant they had justified building the entire post-war system around them, began falling steadily throughout the 1960s. By the end of the decade, the gap between the dollars circulating abroad and the gold actually sitting in American vaults had become impossible to ignore, and increasingly impossible to defend. The system Keynes had warned would concentrate too much unchecked power in American hands had, ironically, become a growing liability for America itself, trapped honoring a gold promise it could no longer realistically keep. Something was going to have to give, and in August 1971, it finally did. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced, with almost no advance warning to America's own allies, that the United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold, the promise that had anchored the entire Bretton Woods system since that hotel in New Hampshire 27 years earlier was simply unilaterally over. Currencies that had been pegged to a gold-backed dollar for nearly 3 decades were now floating freely, their values determined by open markets instead of a fixed international agreement. It's worth being precise about what actually ended that day because it's often misremembered. The dollar's role as the world's dominant reserve currency didn't end in 1971. Only its gold backing did. In some ways, that made America's position even stronger, not weaker. The dollar remained the currency the world needed to trade, save, and borrow in, except now, without any gold constraint at all limiting how many of them the United States could create. The system Keynes had warned about in 1944, one that let a single nation's currency dominate the entire global economy, had, 27 years later, become even more entrenched than the version he'd actually fought against at Bretton Woods. The institutions born in that overcrowded New Hampshire hotel, the IMF, and the World Bank still exist today, still headquartered in Washington, still shaping economic policy in dozens of developing nations around the world, and the dollar's central role, the exact privilege that France's finance minister complained about back in the 1960s, remains the foundation of the global financial system today, still debated, still resented by some nations, and still almost entirely unchallenged in practice. Every so often, some new proposal emerges to challenge that dominance, a shared regional currency, a commodity-backed alternative, a digital reserve asset. Almost every one of them, whether its authors realize it or not, echoes some piece of the exact plan Keynes lost at Bretton Woods 80 years ago. None of them have succeeded yet. The dollar built at that hotel in the summer of 1944 is, in one form or another, still the currency the entire world runs on. Two men walked into that negotiation with two different visions for how global money should work. One of them was trying to prevent any single nation from ever holding too much unchecked financial power. The other represented the nation that was about to hold exactly that. History tells you plainly which vision actually won, and 80 years later, the entire global economy is still living inside the system that victory built. If you made it this far, drop a $sign in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. And if you haven't already, subscribe. It genuinely helps this kind of deep dive keep getting made. I'll see you in the next one.